Yeah, please take a seat for that, I'm sure.
How's it going, guys? Before we get started, can I get a volunteer from each section to just laugh at my jokes? Just kidding, there aren't gonna be any jokes. All right, so this is a talk about how the city is a weakly escaped reality. It's actually a talk about LA. I'm gonna make the case that LA is where this idea of a city and physical space not really being like the most real thing came from. So before we get started, could you raise your hand if you either live in LA now or ever have? Okay, about half of us. It's pretty good. That's about what I expected. And then secondly, could you raise your hand if you've read Venkat's piece on Ribbon Farm on the design of escaped realities? Just a few. Okay, actually pretty good. Yeah. So I'm going to be talking about that a lot in this talk. I'll explain everything you need to know so you don't have to have read it, but it's nice if you have. I was hoping everybody just would have, and then that would have made things a lot easier. So yeah, I'm going to talk about how the urban built environment has moved from this quadrant of the 2x2 that I'm showing you, real versus escapist and digital versus physical. This is kind of when I started thinking about this topic, I always had thought of cities and physical space as existing in a more real reality than like the internet or anything digital. So the idea there was like, when you're a kid and you're playing video games and your mom makes you stop playing video games and go outside, reality is what you enter into. You're leaving an escaped reality, watching TV, you're playing video games, and entering the real world. But upon any reflection at all, we should be able to figure out that that's not actually how it works, and the outside that you enter into is no more real than where you came from. So I moved the urban built environment down to the escapist side of the 4x4, still obviously physical. But then I thought about it a little bit more, and I actually just got rid of the y-axis altogether, because I think that the point of, first of all, Venkat's piece, but also everything we've talked about today should sort of raise the possibility that there's actually no real difference between real and escapist. So that's kind of where I want to start off, and I'm going to now show you this quote, which I actually thought maybe everybody would have put in their talk today, but I don't think I've heard it yet. Reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. So when I first heard that quote, I thought it sort of referred to the physical world and meat space, because that's the most durable form of reality you would think there is. You can turn off any device, anything virtual can sort of be shut down, and when you do that, in theory, you crash out into the real world. Again, when your mom makes you leave the house and go play outside. But this talk is going to be about LA, particularly as the theater of us figuring out how to make the physical world and meat space, particularly the built environment in cities, not work that way. So let's get to, okay, so I live in New York. We have this idea of like New York and LA being diametrically opposed that I think has existed for a long time. These are kind of stereotypes about each city that have been really persistent since they've both been huge. We all have this like individual level, like personal reality bubble that we carry around with us. In New York, that little bubble is always under attack by people that are inches away from you, because it's a very densely populated city. Whereas in LA, your bubble is much more safe, and it's much less likely to be threatened by imminent attacks from all sides. So on the left, we've got the New York subway where someone's sleeping on you, but you studiously ignore it. And that kind of behavior is everywhere in New York. You get really used to it really fast because you can't survive if you don't do that. You'll just be overwhelmed constantly. And then on the right, we have the dude from The Big Lebowski who is just checked out in the middle of the grocery store, and that is much more, I don't know, these are very different stereotypes, but I think over time, these two cities have actually converged and they're much more similar now than people would like to admit. And the reason for that, I would say, is that New York, probably because of digital devices, but for a lot of other reasons, we've gotten better at defending our reality bubbles and creating little spaces where we can not acknowledge this outside consensus reality. And LA has gotten more urban in a lot of ways in the traditional sense, which I'll talk about in a minute. So, and I'll show you these two quotes about Los Angeles. The first one, from 1968, to be able to choose what you want to be and how you want to live without worrying about social censure is obviously more important to Angelenos than the fact they do not have a Piazza San Marco. And then second, from Jeff Manaugh, who you may know as the guy that wrote that Nakatomi space piece, which is also pretty relevant to this topic, Every Mode of Living is Appropriate for LA. He wrote this really good essay about just how LA was his favorite city in the United States, and the reason is that everything you do, like, nobody cares about, and you can just do whatever you want. And my point about New York versus LA is that New York's actually kind of like that too, but you're kind of ignoring people that are like in close proximity to you, and so you can't really preserve the same level of escapism that you can in a place where you're in your car a lot of the time, in a lot of more like privatized, semi-privatized spaces. So this is the outline for the rest of the talk. I'm going to argue that there's traditional urbanism, which is basically what we've lived with for most of human history, this idea that I'll explain in a minute. Basically this idea of how cities are supposed to be and what a real city is, that we're still pretty hung up on. That will be considered a strongly escaped reality, which is, to use a term from Vinkatt's piece. We crashed out of that strongly escaped reality into modernism. And then we re-escaped into what I've called the Holey plane, which is enclaves, bubbles, and networked infrastructure urbanism. So let's start out with the first part of this, the traditional urbanism piece. Here are some pictures of what we think traditional urbanism looks like. This is, so basically all of human history, you know, we've had these tropes like walkable, densely populated, you know, narrow streets, human scale. These are things that made a ton of sense and evolved organically in pre-industrial cities. Even once the Industrial Revolution happened, a lot of these ideas persisted, and then it evolved into like the gridded infrastructure of a place like New York and a lot of American cities and newer parts of older cities in the rest of the world. So we, okay, I'm gonna use the term consensus reality a lot in this talk. This is an idea that comes from this idea of inside versus outside. Consensus reality is what happens out in public in this traditional city. So there's everything inside, which is, you know, more controlled, and then out in public, there's monuments, there's crowds. Everyone has this notion of a shared reality that we're all experiencing together. And that is a strongly escaped reality. It's no more real necessarily than what's going on inside, but, you know, like religion and the state are able to sort of control the narrative through their control of public space. This is a tweet from a couple years ago, or I guess last year and a half ago, by James Bridle, who wrote the book New Dark Age. He was talking about the internet, but he refers to this idea of consensus reality collapsing and fragmenting on the internet. That was sort of in response to like a lot of like algorithmic filter bubble type discussions, but I think it's really applicable to what happens to physical space in what I'm about to tell you. Give me a sec. Yeah, so consensus reality in the old world happens outside. And traditional urbanism, as you can see here, is something that we have a really good mental image of. This is something that, these are all from a thread by that account, Wrath of Gnan, or whatever his name is. He did a big thread about traditional urbanism, basically just wanting to like return to what these images look like. And it's interesting because, you know, these are all like well-preserved European type cities that made a lot of sense for a lot of human history, but are are kind of just these fragments that have been preserved now, and they don't actually have much to do with anything about how the present is. And a lot of stuff, Jane Jacobs published the book Death and Life of American Cities in 1961. That codified this idea of like what orthodox good urbanism is. A lot of it is really like most of what people still think of today. There hasn't been a lot of evolution in the consensus about that, and a lot of it's very accurate. And if you are just thinking about what is a good environment for a person to inhabit, the problem is that it's very antithetical to how the global multinational neoliberal mechanism works, and all we can really do is preserve pockets of this traditional urbanism within the context of something completely different. And then you've probably seen the account, if you follow this stuff at all, new urbanist memes for transit-oriented teens, numtotes. They, just sort of like a simplified version of these values has been really persistent, and we haven't really gotten past this. And a lot of this is just sort of like wishing to turn back the clock on cities. Automobiles are a huge part of the problem with cities, and the last 100 years have been the automobile era, so it's not surprising that people would like to just return to a simpler time when cars did not ruin cities. So this is the Noli map of Rome, which is from 1748. This is something that urbanists often cite as the first example of what's called a figure ground map. So figure ground refers to the black and white of private or inside space and public or outside space. Notably, in 1748 in Rome, the black, which is the built environment, was much more dominant. The white public space is much more constrained and focused. And this was able to sort of create this focused idea of like a public civic life where there would be monuments and just like crowds would gather, and life again happened out in the open. A lot of these narratives, whether religious or political, were artificial themselves, but you could sort of assume that being outside in public in a city like Rome in the 1700s, everybody was on the same wavelength. There was a shared consensus reality, or at least the myth of one existing that everybody could be on board with. And then here's a more recent example of a figure ground map. This is Washington, D.C. Again, the black is fairly dominant. Everything is close together, and public spaces are still well defined. This is just central D.C. Obviously, there's a lot of suburban sprawl that isn't like this, but we're going to come back to this later. Just think for now about the relevance of public space being circumscribed and limited. And then here's some examples of how public space is. This is in Rome again, and this is just these public spaces where like people are out and demonstrations happen there, and people see monuments and think of the symbolic weight of them, et cetera. And then there's another quote from Venkat from the essay I referenced: "A 1,000-year-old temple built of stone in geographic reality represents a far greater suspension of disbelief than a superhero avatar inhabited in a virtual game or a spaceship in a movie universe." What this means is that I used the term strongly escaped reality earlier, and that's something that's much harder to get away from. So the kinds of illusions that persisted in physical space for most of human history, religious iconography, et cetera, were much harder for people who didn't believe them or wanted to crash out of them to escape. Newer forms of escaped reality are much easier to stop believing in, such as a VR experience. Like, nobody who's having a VR experience actually believes that it's really real. So in a sense, it's less, I wouldn't say dangerous, but just less overpowering. And then the traditional city, in the industrial age, we got a lot of grids in cities. Here's a map of Manhattan, and Albert Pope, a guy who wrote a really good book called Ladders about the grid and American urbanism or global urbanism, and then how it sort of collapsed into something that wasn't really legible that replaced it, said that he basically made the case that the grid is synonymous with what we think the city actually is. So when we think of the suburbs as something that's not urban, the grid is usually what we look for when we think about what actually is an urban environment. And that itself is super artificial if you think about it. Like, we have lived with grids our whole lives, but it's actually fairly bizarre to think about the fact that we have these rectilinear patterns that just cover everything and dictate how we use space. The grid in Pope's argument represents what he calls the open city. The open city is, so a grid, the lines extend infinitely in theory. You have Manhattan where it's an island, so that doesn't happen, but in a lot of cities, like Chicago is a good example, you have grid lines at a right angle, and the idea when these grids were built was that the city would just be built outward indefinitely along these grids, and this belief that we all inhabited this shared urban field that would eventually cover all land or whatever. So that obviously didn't happen, and modernism is part of why. I'm going to explain that in a minute, but the open city also kind of aligns with what I was talking about with shared consensus reality. In a shared consensus reality, the grid could be seen as like a coordinate system that aligns everybody around the world. If you built this perfect grid that covered all land, and the United States actually did that in the 1700s. The Northwest Ordinance did survey a grid across all of Middle America that informs a lot of the layouts of the towns that were later built there. And in Manhattan, this entire upper part of the island was surveyed and put on a grid before anyone even lived there. So grids would sort of just like organize space even before it was inhabited, and imply this kind of universalism that cities would fit into. So then modernism happened, and I'm going to do a brief summary of what went down that kind of destroyed a lot of what I just described, including this belief that the grid would go on forever. This is a summary of something from Venkat's piece that is going to be important for the rest of this talk. So in Venkat's characterization of how crashing out of an escaped reality works, first you are in a strongly escaped reality that you safely inhabit. So this would be like, let's say like the Catholic Church or any of these strongly escaped realities that have kind of like characterized ancient existence. So we'll call that traditional urbanism. Then you crash out of it by accident and get alarmingly closer to reality, which is what happened when the world began to rapidly industrialize and cars came into play, and some of these traditional urbanist ideas didn't really work anymore or were actively destroyed. And then finally you retreat hurriedly into a less escaped reality, and modernism was that less womb-like reality that we escaped into. So modernism did a few things. First, it did away aggressively with all of these accumulated traditions and architecture that had built up over time, quite literally just tossed everything and started with a lot of new ideas. The idea that buildings would have ornament on them and communicate to people who saw them, that was sort of gotten rid of in favor of the idea that the form of the building expresses its purpose and really nothing else. So this is Mies van der Rohe building the Barcelona Pavilion, which, as you can see, looks nothing like anything from those earlier pictures I showed you about traditional urbanism, but should actually look pretty familiar to you as an example of a type of building that we see a lot of, and this kind of like replaced a lot of that narrow, dense, walkable urbanism in the last century. This is a sketch by Corbusier. He's famous. He's really the godfather of architectural modernism. In his Tower in the Park model for cities, was really revolutionary at the time that he posited it. The idea here is that there should be huge amounts of space between buildings, and as you can see with these towers, they sort of like float on space like ships on the ocean or something. A complete upending of even the grid idea of what cities should be. And then finally, modernism fetishized a lot of the new industrial products of the early 20th century, including cars, trains, high-speed transportation, factories. This is a sketch from the Italian futurist Santiglia, and he did a bunch of these cool sketches that are sort of like hyper dense, like speed structures, like buildings interpenetrated with freeway underpasses and rail stations. This actually, is a fairly accurate description of certain things that we've ended up with in cities, but no one is really like that excited about those types of spaces anymore. It's worth checking him out. A lot of his sketches are really beautiful, and it kind of represents this period when people were excited about things like cars instead of trying to get rid of them. And I mentioned that modernism changed our relationship between the figure and ground. So these are three, Venice, London, Paris, obviously cities that developed over time and had a lot of dense construction within them. Brasilia is a city, the capital of Brazil was built from scratch in the 1950s by modernist architects. As you can see, the figure and ground relationship has been inverted. So now the white open space predominates, and there's just a few scattered buildings. When space became sort of excessive in this way, after modernism really remade a lot of the globe and a lot of the places that were being developed at that time, it sort of defocused public space and made it hard for people to really inhabit it in the same way. If you have too much public space, then there's no concentrations of people anywhere, and culture can't really happen in them in the same way. So what accompanied this development was an interiorizing of what was formerly happening in public, and we're going to talk about that happening in LA soon. So here's actually a map of LA next to Orange County. I was talking about the grid, the myth of the grid being extended indefinitely. It's kind of hard to see, but on the left, Los Angeles, which was developed earlier than Orange County, actually does have a lot of grid-style urbanism. They're more like super blocks, so it's not really the same as like the grid in New York City. On the right, you can see the grid sort of abruptly end in favor of these winding streets that interrupt it. So Albert Pope, who I mentioned earlier in his book, talks about, he calls this the implosion of the grid. Instead of having the grid just go on forever, it gets cut off, and then these downtown areas that have a grid become these like isolated units surrounded by this illegible sea of suburbia with winding cul-de-sacs and non-rectilinear streets. And this ultimately left us with what I call the Holey Plain. So the Holey Plain is actually quite similar to what Chanot talked about a minute ago. We now experience space in this sort of like discontiguous, fragmented way. It's a lot of enclaves and bubbles stitched together by high-speed transportation. This cloverleaf interchange is in LA. As you can see, there's like a lot of more traditional type development on all four sides of it, but a huge amount of space has been reallocated to this high-speed transportation infrastructure, which means the only way to get between these formerly walkable places is now driving, and because everything's so far apart, you have to drive even if you can physically get across this barrier, which you probably can't. And then this is a photo of the Cross Bronx Expressway being built in New York City. This is one of Robert Moses's legacies. Robert Moses was a huge actor in New York in terms of creating Holey Plain style urbanism in a place like New York, which still has a lot of traditional like urban fabric where you can walk places, but the work that Robert Moses did to so this is a huge tunnel basically being dug through a city where people lived. Huge amounts of people were evicted. So sometimes this transition to fragmented Holey Plain urbanism was quite violent, and it wasn't like an organic process in many cases, which maybe not be visible to everybody now. So we're coming to the Holey Plain. One thing I want to say also about the Holey Plain, what I just described, Elon Musk has sort of emerged in this climate of us having lived with the Holey Plain for many decades, with a sort of cartoonish, like oversimplified version of forms of transportation that teleport us through these wormholes from one place to another. So the freeway is that, if you think about it, or air travel. Flying from New York to LA in 6 hours is a kind of teleportation. So really is being able to drive hundreds of miles in a day at 70 miles an hour. And now like things like the Hyperloop and the Boring Tunnel, which seems to be getting less and less different than things we're already familiar with every day, are just kind of like taking that to its limit, but also not really like seriously engaging with the existing landscape and promising faster and faster forms of transportation that like essentially teleport you from one place to another. So to remind you of what Venkat's points were, remember, we're designing a strongly escaped reality. We can inhabit. That was traditional urbanism. We crashed out of it, and then we retreated into modernism. Now, how do we escape from modernism and get to where we are now? So here's an example from LA of there's a town called Palos Verdes Estates. You can see it on the map right there, and you can see in that photo that there's a sort of traditional Italian-looking piazza that is full of cars. This town was actually designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed New York Central Park and was probably the most famous landscape architect ever. So he designed some truly vital public spaces that still persist in cities. But in LA, Rainer Banham, who is probably the best person to read on LA urbanism and just appreciating how weird and unique it is. He wrote this book in 1971 called The Architecture of Four Ecologies, and he made the case that in LA, unlike other cities that had preceded it, there's this thing called the art of the enclave. So instead of like town or city level urban planning that unifies everything under an umbrella of like civic purpose, each individual community would sort of do its own urban planning, not with any pretense of doing it for any kind of like civic reason, but just to create recreational spaces or enhance real estate values. So this is this town. He observes that the best urban planning in LA has basically just been deployed to make people feel like they don't actually live in a city, and that's pretty interesting. And these are two malls in Los Angeles, the Grove and the Americana, which, raise your hand if you've been to either of these. So they're kind of like awesome places to go, which is interesting because in LA, and this is Rainer Banham's point that he makes later in that chapter, The Art of the Enclave, the mall in LA is actually where a lot of the best pedestrian spaces can be found and a lot of the best sort of urban planning. It's always kind of simulated though, like it's this pocket of like fake walkable traditional urbanism, but you have to drive to it and it's surrounded by parking lots. But once you're inside it, it's pretty great. To me, these two images don't actually look that different than the ones I showed you earlier. They're essentially kind of like versions of the same thing. Obviously there's differences, but I think it's pretty interesting that this kind of like simulated urbanism has become so potent. And here's an LA shopping mall in 1950, so this is sort of a modernist version of the mall. Like you could walk around inside it, but much less inviting than what we've escaped into. So when you crash out via modernism, this is what you have, but then you escape into something that is nicer and easier to inhabit. Now this new reality is not as strongly escaped. So nobody's fooled by this. We like going, but nobody thinks the Grove is real by any by any standard. But it doesn't mean that we won't feel good if we go and hang out there. And then of course we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about Disneyland, which is really like another level of this. So I would say that like Disney and the malls and real estate developments I just described are more different in degree than in kind. Rainer Banham had some great things to say about Disneyland. One, he pointed out that Hollywood's technical skill and resources made LA a place where these physical fantasy structures could be built, and people actually use them and go to them frequently, which is pretty cool. And then secondly, he had a really cynical comment about how Disneyland is almost the only place where East Coast town planning snobs can bring their students to see how a pedestrian environment actually looks. Even though they hate Disneyland, it's one of the only places, this book was written in 1971, where urban planning principles that were failing to be executed elsewhere could actually be observed to succeed. So the key here is that the enclave you basically shrink the space that you can control to a small enough size, and then you can do whatever you want in it. The real urban planning at the city scale became harder and harder in the face of all of these industrial and economic changes that were undermining it. And then Albert Pope has a good quote: "The single overriding ambition of urbanism today is to enhance and refine our ability to simulate the world." Marshall McLuhan said the city no longer exists except as a cultural ghost for tourists. Those might be a bit too harsh themselves, but I think that they're both really important to keep in mind, because now I think we're in an era now where there's a lot of really exciting efforts going on to like redevelop downtowns and make them more walkable. But what you might notice about a lot of those is that they're confined to very small spaces that are being gentrified, and outside of them you've still got the same mess of sprawl and car dependence that you always had. I didn't think I was going to talk about scooters in this presentation, but I actually realized that I had something to say about them, which is, so like, I haven't been to LA since before there were scooters everywhere. And I kind of pictured them being like all over the city, covering it comprehensively, but I was looking at this map of like where the scooters actually are in LA, and you can see there's really only a few places that they all are. So everything else, like Beverly Hills has no scooters. It's in between two of those circles, and there's just huge swaths of the city where you're not using scooters. So Santa Monica is like the birthplace of the bird scooter. Santa Monica is a very walkable and sort of traditional style urban environment, and there's a few to be found like that throughout the city, but they're kind of like under attack and surrounded by environments that aren't like that. So you can pretend that LA is like a traditional city if you stay in Santa Monica, but you're probably gonna have to leave at some point, and then you're gonna realize that you have to get on the freeway just like everybody else does. This is another LA landmark. Frederick Jameson, who wrote the sort of definitive text on postmodernism, used the Westin Bonaventure Hotel, which is in downtown LA, as his leading example of what postmodernism is. This is a hotel that was designed in the 70s by the architect John Portman. You've probably been in one of his hotels. He sort of became famous around that time for building these concrete hotels with like massive interior atriums that had no relationship to the downtown environment where they were situated. So there's like the Peachtree Plaza in Atlanta, the Renaissance Center in Detroit, Westin Bonaventure, and a lot of other hotels that are all pretty much the same template, and they're kind of like fortresses from the outside. So Albert Pope described this as like a rift in the mappable grid of downtown. You can't, I've been to it before, you can't really even get into it except through the parking garage. It's kind of meant to be accessed by car and not on foot. It is like a fortress where you just want to be inside. But what was really interesting about it is what Jameson wrote about it, which is that it represented our loss of cognitive bearings and basically our disorientation in the face of global multinational capitalism. So once you're inside the Bonaventure Hotel, you have no idea what its relationship is to anything outside. There's no real windows, you don't know how you got there, you don't know how to get out, and it sort of is a metaphor for how we are completely disoriented in this like late capitalist stage when all of our previous things that oriented us, like the grid, for example, have kind of been dismantled. and we're just afloat in this overwhelming universe where we don't know what's going on. And Jameson actually compared that hotel to Blade Runner, also set in LA. The distinction between an interior and an exterior, where inside is highly controlled corporate space where everything is very legible and clean, and then an outside that's like messy and chaotic and sort of dangerous, and where this seedy underworld happens. So a lot of these same theorists have been getting at the same point, which is that in the enclave, everything is kind of safe and calm and regimented, and then outside, people are just like it's chaos, and no one really has any control over anything. And this leads us to where we are now, which is we have the Instagrammable city. So the Holey Plain, because we live among a bunch of enclaves that are just sort of floating in space, the thing that actually unifies them all is the internet and digital tools. So I've often observed that the meat space is the content for the internet now, and Instagram is just one facet of that all these new monuments and public spaces that get built a lot of times are for being consumed via Instagram, et cetera. So I was talking about the open city earlier, and how like the grid and the idea of like a consistent coordinate system unified us, and we felt like we were all part of a shared consensus reality. Now the internet has provided that for us. Facebook is a good example. I think Facebook was like the grid for physical cities, in that you felt like you could go on Facebook and it was where the shared consensus reality is happening. But now we seem to be retreating from those kinds of environments into these like warrens and like dark pools of like private communication, which is actually quite similar to what I just described happening in a city like LA. We're building enclaves and reproducing a Holey Plain in what was like the open internet. So we're losing another source of shared reality, and I don't think that that's necessarily bad. I'm not really making a value judgment on any of this stuff, but I'm just kind of trying to point out that what happened to meat space is kind of a metaphor for what's now happening to the way we use the internet, and this kind of closing off of things that were previously open has a corollary in what happened to cities last century. These are a few examples of tech HQs. The guy who wrote The Stack, Benjamin Bratton, had a really interesting chapter in that book about how big tech companies' headquarters reflect their worldview more truthfully than a lot of the other PR that they have. And I think Apple's and Facebook's and Google's in different ways all kind of show that. So Apple's headquarters is sort of like a large Apple device. It's totally like closed off from its surroundings. Very elegant and beautifully designed, but not. It's like a closed system. Facebook they're all huge enclaves that don't really have any relationship to the surrounding urban fabric. I didn't put Amazon on here. Amazon, interestingly, does have a better relationship to its urban fabric. I don't know what that means about Amazon's worldview, but it's interesting that like the internet sort of creates this like really the only thing we have for unifying all our fragmented space, but the headquarters themselves are still like the most enclave type buildings that we have. So my question that I'm going to leave you guys with as we wrap this up is, what does it mean if we've escaped into this new urban reality where we just kind of create our own enclave and believe whatever we want there? What happens when we crash out of that, and when we do, what do we escape back into? And I will leave you with this quote from Norbert Weiner. There are local and temporary islands of decreasing entropy in a world in which the entropy as a whole tends to increase, and the existence of these islands enables some of us to assert the existence of progress, which I think is it's a pretty good description of what's happening in our enclaves. You can live in like a nice, walkable downtown in like Nashville or here, or even New York has taken on a lot of these characteristics, and feel like cities are great and we've sort of like fixed all of their problems, but those are just like isolated islands of decreasing entropy in the context of a legible mass where that's not the case. So that's the talk. Thanks for listening, and it's the end of the day.
I want to point out a couple of very quick connections before I let people get into questioning. One is Sarah has written two really excellent complementary articles to this, Frontierland and Gardens with Walls. I think those two together go very well with this talk. Another connection I wanted to point out was Matt, I think you tweeted something about Hyperloop that is very relevant. Elon Musk had just tweeted the Hyperloop teleporting thing, and Matt made the point that it just teleports traffic jams from point to point.
That's good.
And I wanted to connect that to what you said when you said that there's a connection here between weak and strong escape and weak and strong entanglements in a quantum sense. I'm being very metaphorical, but I'd like to see that unpacked a little somewhere maybe tomorrow.
Yeah, that's great. I'll think about that.
You made a couple of jokes about light rails, and I've been seeing them pop up in every like tier 2, tier 3 city. What's going on with that? Is there like a short explanation that I'm missing?
I mean, like it's better to have light rail than not. It's probably not like, so one thing about light rail is like buses are usually like a better return on the investment than light rail, but light rail serves a symbolic function where like if a city gets a light rail system, it like, it feels like cool or whatever. So cities want light rail because it kind of like symbolizes a lot of good things about a city. I'm not like trying to like hate on light rail or anything, but I think from what I know, it's often not the best solution, but it does like kind of look appealing. People like to see it even if they don't write it.
How do you think of the tech founders that you kind of alluded to with the Tech HQ comparison as they relate to Robert Moses, like makers of progress in the past?
You want to say the last part again? I didn't hear it.
How do you relate those people to Robert Moses, like makers of progress in the past?
So that's actually a pretty interesting parallel. I mean, I always thought that like Facebook was also kind of modernist because it's like a legibility engine, like modernism was, in being overlaid on like a lot of ecosystems that were much harder for us to like have visibility into. And so it did create this moment when like you kind of felt like the whole world was unified on one platform, even if that itself was a myth. It was a pretty powerful myth for maybe like 10 years before it seems to now be not persisting anymore.
So this is sort of a philosophical question, but do you think there's any relationship between, let's say, the dense, gridded, built-up versus winding, chaotic, and more suburban thing, and like a collectivist and an individualist mindset?
I do, yeah. I mean, one thing about like the sort of winding, like cul-de-sac style of urban development is it's like, it's easy. I think it's almost like more secure, and people who want to like close themselves off, it's like a better street layout for like minimizing the number of entrances into a neighborhood, whereas the grid kind of maximizes the connections between adjacent spaces. So like, the fewer connections you have, the more you can kind of control your own reality within your enclave. Cul-de-sac, like a lot of cul-de-sac style neighborhoods, like the one I grew up in, there were just 2 entrances on either side, and then like a whole like closed series of like circles in the middle. And yeah, there was no through traffic because like it's just hard. It's not really convenient for anybody. So it goes well with that whole like idea of enclaves. And again, that's actually addressed in that book Ladders by Albert Pope that I was talking about. I'd recommend that to anyone that's interested in this topic, grids and stuff like that. Thanks.
How do you think the next phase of crashing out will be affected by driving automation?
Automation. That's a great question. I was actually hoping that the audience could tell me what the next phase of crashing out will be, but automation, I mean, first of all, it depends when you think that will happen and how it will happen. Like, I'm a little bit skeptical that it will be as comprehensive in like even the medium term as people seem to think, but there's a huge, actually Chanot wrote a really, probably like the best piece on that I've read. What was it called? Perpetual motion machines. That's sort of like what I would answer with, is like what she describes in that essay. So if someone shares it around, or like I'll send it out somewhere, but I'd recommend reading that. It's kind of about how like space will just become like using a search engine, and nothing will be adjacent to anything else. You'll just get in a car and like close the windows and then end up somewhere new, which is how, it's not that different than how driving is now, actually. Just like you don't really have to be as engaged anymore. Yeah.
This might not be very coherent, which I apologize for, but I feel like there's something to say about the relation between consensus reality, as you're talking about it, and the second keynote today about spatial intelligence, where you can look at, like, there's an assumption behind this concept of like the emergence of these enclaves about spaces being static, where like if you want to have a particular experience, you have to build a space that affords that experience. But that assumption seems to be changing as we have like more technology so that we can build spaces that are reconfigurable, or even a stronger version of that where we can like per person modify our experience through AR and whatnot. So I'm wondering if you see that like relating to how we share spaces, or if like you see that like playing into the future you're talking about, or if you have any thoughts related to that at all.
This might not answer like every part of your question completely, but I think a lot about that. And I think it's really, actually during that talk, I was thinking about how it's really interesting that like the internet that we got is sort of like non-spatial. It's like purely like topological, but the earlier versions of the internet were more spatial, just because they like grew up out of like physical communities. But then once they matured, they sort of like converged on this huge like non-spatialized space. And I thought he was kind of calling for a return to like a spatialized version of the internet, which I think would be great. I don't know how we get there, but like, I think there's like an appetite for people to like be more like situated in like localized things, and not just be adrift in this like massive network where like anything is possible.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. Okay, so on this topic of like the return to enclaves, clearly this is something that a lot of people think are happening. Lots of people on Mastodon, lots of people are. I just saw somebody talking about sending private essays and email to one another. Like this is something that people think is happening. I need to listen. But at the same time, so I listened to Facebook's recent earnings call, and one thing that they talked about is that they're doubling down on groups because they've realized that groups is their killer use case outside of events. And theoretically, in the next year, they're going to be transitioning much more of their mobile and desktop interface, like default landing experience and interface, to be around the group experience. I guess, well, actually, this reminds me of like the idea that came up earlier. What is more infinite, like the space of the Earth or the internet? And,
Yeah.
If Facebook represents, as it clearly did, this very modernist approach to internet-based like space and identity, what is this like movement towards groups? Like, what is this like a re-territorialization? Is it like a messiness that grows within Facebook? How do you see how that may play out?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing that Facebook still offers, even if you hate it, is that like so many more people are still on it. So like it's easier to, like the group, like the meetup group that we have for like Ribbon Farm NYC is still on Facebook, and we've tried to move off of it in different ways, but it's still like the one thing that everybody actually uses. So I think that's like what is going to keep that durable and keep it maybe on Facebook, it's like harder to escape from because it's become so comprehensive. Maybe almost like a layer that's like more durable, like almost like physical space than.
But is Facebook capable, if as this like originally modernist framework, is it capable of providing this like return to a more weakly escaped traditional type of urbanism, which is like in this kind of parallel that you've set up?
Probably not, or it will probably be, there's a lot of different iterations of that, like weakly escaped urbanism, and some of them are more pleasant to be in than others, so it might just be kind of like a shittier, like escaped reality or something. Yeah, exactly. Like think about the worst fake public spaces that you've been in, and maybe Facebook's will be like those, or maybe it'll do well. And yeah, if you're really just trying to build a little community that's only you and your friends, then like, what does Facebook really have to offer? You can just take that in your own hands and put it wherever you want. Facebook's more for like if you want, I guess, like other random people to be able to like interact with it. But if like 5 of us wanted to just build our own little thing, then we don't need Facebook for that. Yeah.
I was sort of thinking out loud, I guess, but I was trying to figure out like, if we're going to be worried, what direction cities are going to go, right? It seems like what would be important is why do we even have cities in the first place? And the best I can figure at the moment is we have cities because they increase economic output, because you just concentrate everybody in one place. Stuff they could have theoretically done anywhere. They all do it on top of each other. They know about each other. It's easier for them to talk to each other. It's easier to collaborate.
Yeah.
There's stuff like farming, which needs a lot of space, so it's got to be out of the way, right? But there's stuff that doesn't need a lot of space. You concentrate it all in one place.
Yeah.
So it seems like the direction it'll probably go is whatever increases economic output more.
Yeah.
That might be like layering alternate realities like on top of it, so it gets even denser. Like one thing that seems like with augmented reality and virtual reality, right, is that you're going to have that breakdown of consensus reality, where instead of you used to live physically in the same place, and so you had to have the same consensus reality.
Yeah.
But if it minimizes it, like if a lot of people can like travel in little pods and not have to like walk in physical places, and then they can just be hooked into their, whatever in 15 years the version of AirPods is.
Yeah.
Goggles, air goggles or something. So they just like are always in their own little world, sort of like shepherded physically from one place to another. Maybe that'll like increase the economic output because they'll be able to like talk to somebody in China and like see the part, and then they'll be able to like go to a dinner with a financier or something, and maybe that'll like
Yeah.
everything up more.
Yeah, and I think we're already pretty far along like that. Even like things that are already completely ordinary to us, like doing like a Zoom call or something, are like versions of that we already have like completely embraced. But yeah, I would also like, something that I've thought of when you were asking that question is, what do we all agree on what a city even is? Like everyone knows that like New York and Los Angeles are cities, but like what about like 3 hours outside of New York? Like what do we think of that? Like all these sort of like kind of sprawly like suburban spaces that people don't really like, depending on who you're asking. Like some people don't really think of them as cities. Some people don't even know what goes on in like, if you live in New York and just like fly between like major cities, then like you have no idea what is out there. But it's like where so many people live, and like I think some people are like, really interested in like solving the kind of problems that cities have in those outer like exurbs, but for many more people, I think they're just invisible.
It seems like the tractable idea from one of the other talks.
Yeah.
I love it because the better the technology gets, the faster you can close the gap between where you are and where you want to be. So
Yeah.
like SpaceX wants to do rockets suborbital, right, just from one spot on the Earth to another, just like an airplane. So like you take a 1 hour hop from LA to San Francisco, and they're like one city, effectively.
Yeah.
So you can do like a half-hour hop from New York to Tokyo, and they become like one city.
Totally. Yeah.
It makes it more tractable, right? Where
Yeah.
they just operate as one.
Yeah, and like we're getting, I can already kind of sense like, even though it feels like it's really difficult to fly between those cities now, it's just imagine like how much easier it is than like than it used to be, or the fact that we're all in this room doing Refactor Camp when we all have like primarily interacted on the internet, but it's not like hard to make something like this happen. And I don't know, like, again, it's like already become really ordinary, like, and it'll just, like, more and more like will be shaved off of the travel time between cities, and we'll have more sophisticated tools for interacting remotely. So like space will just continue to be annihilated. But I think a lot of it already has been annihilated.
Wondering if you had any thoughts on kind of pace layering, like Stuart Brand, kind of the infrastructure operating at a different changes the infrastructure.
Like the shearing layers thing.
Right,
or like,
exactly.
Yeah.
But, infrastructure in particular is a key part of cities, and and then above infrastructure is kind of commerce, and above that is fashion. Like these realities, like where do they live, or how do they connect to those interacting levels of which operate at different speeds?
Yeah, I would say like the higher the level, the more like manipulable it is, and like the lower levels are more durable. So like in that 2x2 I showed at the beginning, where it was like physical, digital, and like real and escaped. Like I thought, there's the city, which is like a cultural product, and it's maybe like a little bit more escapist, but like the layers below that are like, like something like geological formations, or maybe that's more real than a city. It's another physical.
It feels like a lot of the infrastructure that supports cities is still very modernist, big state planning, legibility stuff.
Yeah.
And when you start talking about Facebook as that, like, and why Facebook still remains this infrastructure, its ubiquity creates this infrastructural element to it. I don't know, there's something.
Well, I think one of the things that modernism was addressing, and like Banham in his book about LA makes a really interesting point about how like all the transportation infrastructure, it's like a palimpsest where everything is overlaid on a city that was optimized for the previous version of it. So like all the freeways were built, like LA used to have a great like streetcar system, and that's why a lot of these, that's why Santa Monica is the way it is. But then like the freeways were like laid on top of that. So like the city was not optimized for freeways. And if you're a true modernist, you would rather like build a city from scratch than have to like deal with the fabric of an existing city. So like, I mean, in Robert Moses' case, that involved a lot of like outright destruction of what was already there. But New York, it was like, they didn't do enough. So like, it's still like all the roads are really congested, and place like, I don't know, a lot of like cities that are much newer, like even they have bad traffic, but I think they flow a lot better than a place like New York or Los Angeles.
Doesn't the traffic increase to occupy the space allotted to it?
Yeah. So that is pretty much always the case. Yep.
So I thought it was interesting how your talk got a lot of its initial momentum from the trope of a debate between traditional and modern architecture. And I mean, I saw how you came to some discussions of how that debate could be more nuanced with like overlap between the two. But in general, I mean, I find it fascinating. I mean, considering the audience in this room, which the talk was obviously tailored for. I mean, it's interesting how people in the technology industry are generally much more troubled by modern architecture than most contemporary architects are. And I'd be curious to hear about your perspective on that.
Do you have any theories? Like, I think that's a great point that I feel like, well, like we all like read Sea and Like a State, and that's sort of like a book that just slams modernism. And maybe that's like part of it, that we just like, it kind of depends on what your sources are, but like the aesthetics of modernist architecture are like incredible. So if that's what you care about more, I love modernist architecture, and modernist architecture is kind of also different than like modernist urbanism. Like an individual building can be like really elegant as like a freestanding object, but it might have a bad relationship to the space around it. So yeah, and like a lot of the things that kind of came out of modernism weren't like the explicit goals of the modernists, but they ended up just not working as well, because it's usually not better to like build something from scratch than like capitalizing on like an existing system that works well. All right. Thanks for listening, guys.
Thanks, Drew.
All right, well, that's a wrap for day one. Yeah, have at it. Instigator, heckler. Cool.
Is this the hint?
Yeah.
Okay. Can I make a shirt announcement? Oh. Hi, excuse me. So I'm gonna do a short demo of my keyboard thing up there. So if you're interested, that'll start in a few minutes. Yeah, thank you.
Cool, sounds good. If y'all could straighten out the rows just so it looks a little bit tidier for tomorrow morning, that'd be great. Also, yeah, any kind of like egregious like spills and stuff, please take care of. And yeah, thank you.
Just good old fashioned like normal like raft. That's pretty interesting stuff. But yeah, it's hard to like